Good evening, I'm Jake and I'm here with Sarah, and welcome to Public Pictures Theater. Tonight we'll be watching a rendition of the timeless classic, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This is a 1923 silent film that stars renowned silent film actor Lon Chaney as the titular Quasimodo.
This movie is known as Universal's Super Jewel and is one of their highest grossing silent films that they ever made, earning $3.5 million. It also propelled Lon Chaney's career into superstardom in Hollywood, leading to several roles in groundbreaking films, including The Phantom of the Opera.
The sets for The Hunchback of Notre Dame were designed to be historically accurate and at many times to scale. They took around 6 months in total to build. Filming was not easy, as several hundred extras were required, along with 3,000 different costumes. Director Wallace Worsley eventually got rid of his megaphone and started directing his extras with a radio and loudspeaker, a luxury item at the time that would have cost in today's money over $100,000.
None of the film's original prints have survived to this day, and most of them have been disposed of by Universal. The only copies that exist today are the 16mm home versions. It entered the realm of the public domain in 1951 after a failure to renew its copyright.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy a film on us. It's The Hunchback of Notre Dame tonight on Public Pictures Theater.
Hello, welcome back to Public Pictures Theater. I'm Sarah, and I'm here with Dr. Starr, John, and Jake, and we just finished watching The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So let's talk about this story compared to the very classic Disney film that a lot of people are familiar with, especially from the millennial generation. How did you guys think this silent film from 1923 compared to that Disney film?
Well, Quasimodo was definitely different. The main character, more or less, was him in the Disney movie. It was more focused around Esmeralda in this one, and also Quasimodo's character, he couldn't talk, he could barely see. He kind of acted almost like an animal sometimes, whereas he was kind of like this much more articulate and expressed his emotions a lot more in The Hunchback of Notre Dame that was made by Disney. And also, there were no gargoyles that he imagined in this one. He was very lonely up there.
Very much missing those singing gargoyles. So what's different about watching a silent film than watching a film with sound? Are you more and less engaged with the story when there is sound involved?
Well, I mean, watching a silent film is a lot more difficult, of course, because we're kind of used to the whole hearing the dialogue and the sound and then having to read it. Most audiences are not really used to actually having to read the dialogue in the screen. They just want to hear it and they just want to just enjoy the film. So this is definitely a lot more difficult, but at the same time still interesting the way it was presented.
You're definitely locked onto the screen, and I think if you watch silent movies for a while, you get a knack for watching the action and reading at the same, because if you have to stop and read and there's action going on, sometimes it's, even though if they have a slate, it chops the movie up. So I think after a while, if you get a knack for it, it's a lot easier to do.
Definitely.
It's one of the ironic things about these two Hunchback of Notre Dames was Charles Laughton did the 1938 or 39 version with Maureen O'Hara, and then this one with Lon Chaney, and both characters, as we know, don't speak. Mm-hmm. Which is funny. I mean, they speak throughout the movie, the version with Charles Laughton, but the character doesn't speak. I think he mutters a little bit at the end, and he asks for when he goes to the church. I forget what he says. He says, I'm not going to remember. Mm-hmm. Anyways, but the two of them together, it's really interesting. They're basically silent characters. One's in a true silent movie, though, which is was Lon Chaney.
Yeah.
What do you think about silent films, Jake?
You know, honestly, I find them more boring than regular films, mainly just because there's a level of immersion that just isn't there. Like sound effects are real. You know, they're part of every conversation, every location, everything. If you want to immerse somebody in your film, I think that the orchestral scores in silent films are generally pretty good. But I think it only works really well if you're going for more of like something much more physical. Like I like Charlie Chaplin because it's slapstick with a little bit of text in there. Like the action kind of speaks for itself, so it keeps you engaged. But if there's a lot of them standing around moving their mouths and then I have to read afterwards, it just kind of loses me after a while. I prefer films with sound.
And I think that's a good point. On the
Yeah.
opposite end of the spectrum, I'm one of those people who will put a movie on and then I will go do 4 other things while watching it. And the audio helps me, know what's going on in the movie. But if I'm watching a silent film, that's the only thing I can be
You may
doing
only
at the time.
just hear piano playing.
Yeah. So I think for me, I
Sometimes
have
fun.
to be much more engaged in a silent film than in
Yeah.
a
You're
film that I've
locked
seen with
on.
audio.
You don't have, you have to watch that screen.
Absolutely. So what did you think of Lon Chaney as Quasimodo? Was his performance convincing as...
Absolutely. I think that propelled him. He was one of the greatest actors, and not only in the silent era, but in general. He was wonderful, and he blew people's minds. That the makeup that he would put on and the performance that he put on in this picture it's unprecedented. Charles Laughton did it again. He did a great job. But this was one of the first times that effort and that amount of makeup ever went into a production. It's so convincing, remarkable.
What did you guys think of Lon Chaney in the film?
Well, I just thought that going on with the whole aspect of being a silent film, usually like the performance in there had to like move a lot more exaggerated and express a lot more emotions. And Lon Chaney basically, I was surprised with all of his stunts basically and all the jumps that he did and how dangerous they actually looked and how he actually had to basically express emotions more than actors have to do it today because there's no sound, there's no dialogue that they're actually speaking. It's just you have to read it. So they basically had to show more of what they're feeling and everything. And I just thought he did a great job at that.
The very famous movie actress Dolores Costello once said that, and she was from the silent era. A lot of the actors and actresses in the silent era, a lot of them didn't make it in when the talkies came in, and so there was some resentment. I don't know if Dolores had resentment, but she always thought that silent movie actors and actresses had a finer art to communicate the roles that they had to put on for the camera, as opposed to someone who could explain it away in dialogue. So she said ours was a truly fine art, but that's not to say talkie actors and actresses aren't fine actors as well.
True.
So do you think the film focused too much on Quasimodo or too much on Esmeralda? What was the balance, and do you think they reached some kind of balance between those two characters?
Now, I was watching, and there were just so many scenes with Esmeralda, people talking about Esmeralda, stuff where Esmeralda is kind of like the subject of the scene. And I'm just sitting there thinking, like, isn't this called the Hunchback of Notre Dame? Like, where is the Hunchback? And he shows up, and like he almost sometimes leaves as quickly as he came. He shows up, and then he gets whipped, and then Esmeralda comes and saves him, and I'm like, oh, this again. I think they focus a little bit too much on her, and not enough on him.
I would agree. I think there's a little bit too much on her. I'd rather see more on him. It's still a wonderful picture.
Yeah.
Must be critical, but that's the one thing I found.
So films like this during the 1920s were actually filmed on studio lots, and they were sets where they would build entire buildings or have painted backgrounds. The cathedral in the film was actually still standing until 1967. So how did this set compare to modern day films where they create everything out of CGI and it's all computer graphics? Did you guys think the set looked more realistic, or are you much more interested in the CGI aspect of modern films?
I think whenever a film has practical sets, they are a lot more believable. They look a lot more real, a lot more organic. When you have CGI, it does not look that believable. You can sometimes even notice it. So basically building huge sets like that, especially how they build the whole cathedral and all that, made it look like a lot more believable, like it was actually filmed on a real village of that time.
I thought it looked pretty believable. I was actually like sitting there watching. I'm like, did they actually go to a real cathedral somewhere and film this? They did a really good job, especially with the architecture. Like they built like actual statues, and they were big. They were like to scale. And I think back then you had to be a lot more creative with your set design, and you actually had to have some really talented people behind it. Not that people who don't design CGI aren't talented, but I think there's a lot more craftsmanship that goes into actually building a set that looks believable and is also structurally sound than putting something on a computer. Plus, I think if they would have used special effects, CGI, anything computer generated at all, it wouldn't have lent itself as well to this, because it's a historical piece and you want it to look more realistic, more gritty, more...
That's a good point.
But something like science fiction, like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, you can kind of get away with that because it's fantasy or it's sci-fi or it's something that's not supposed to be believable. I think that something like this, that's historical and more grounded in reality, is better suited to something like that. Especially the effects that they did for Quasimodo. They were very convincing. He looked very grotesque, and that's what they were going for. Like I never understood, like back in the Disney version, I'm like, why are they afraid of this guy? And then I see him in this one, and I'm like, yeah, he'd be a little off-putting if he walked up next to me.
Yeah.
Basically, I mean, the whole with the practical thing, it actually also helps the actors get into character more than having a CGI or green screen, because
I agree. I sometimes wonder how they can. I don't know how they set them up in order to act if it's not there. I guess that it falls on the director to say, look, this is what's going to be there. When we're finally done with the picture. But I agree with you. If it's actually there, physically there, it seems to me it would be easier to act.
So a lot easier, rather than the actors having to use their imagination and creativity. They just
That's
can
a good point.
basically interact with their surroundings. And there's like something, the table has like food. It's not like fake food. It's actually like real there, and they can just interact with it. It's easier on the acting.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Public Pictures Theater, and have a great night.